we're going to have Michael Kaskey-Blomain join us now because after the news earlier today, Woj from ESPN spoke with Josh Harris, owner of the Philadelphia 76ers, and had some very interesting things to say regarding the GM position, Brett Brown's role, and the rest of the front office and where they're at in that search, if they're searching at all. So we're going to bring MKB into the conversation and dive into this report from Adrian Wojnarowski and get to the bottom of what's going on from the Philadelphia 76ers standpoint. So MKB, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good, man. How are you guys doing?
We're doing good. We're doing good. Thanks for joining us. So I'm just going to get right into it. I mean, this is really, like, I don't know how to feel about this at all. Like, I understand that they need to be patient. I understand that they're not just going to get the next available guy to come in here, especially after everything that happened. Brett Brown seems to have been more than capable so far in this interim role, making a couple nice moves, keeping the ship afloat. But the season's right around the corner. I mean, this guy's kind of got a full-time job already as the head coach of the team, and just to say he's still going to be heavily involved with all this front office stuff coming off of the Colangelo, saga and everything else. I mean, what do you make with Josh Harris saying it leaves open the possibility of them being a GM by committee organization?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a strange situation, Ryan. It's something that, you didn't expect. I understood at first that it would be a process where they were going to take their time, in naming a successor for Colangelo. And once they got through, free agency and the draft, there was obviously no pressing need to get someone in right away. But I was certainly, under the impression, or at least I thought, that they would bring someone in, before training camp started next month. I thought, this next 3 to 4 weeks would be a time where they would really kind of, turn up the heat in terms of the search a little bit and really try to narrow it down and get a guy in there. And the comments from, Josh Harris to Adrian Wojnarowski just don't vibe with that at all. It seems like there's really no, they're not in a rush to do it before the season starts. I think they feel, pretty comfortable with the triumvirate of guys that they have in there now, with Brett being like the, kind of the head decision maker, and then some other guys at the table around him. It's kind of strange that Josh seemed to kind of leave it, like you said, kind of just like an open door, whereas, maybe if they're blown away by someone within the next few weeks, they could move as quickly as then. But if they're not, it seems like a situation that they feel comfortable at least continuing with the current structure of things, which, is kind of interesting to me, kind of a head scratcher, because like you said, I think Brett really has a full plate as it is, trying to turn this team into take the next step after going to the semifinals last year. And it's something that he, hasn't necessarily expressed interest in. He's not, he hasn't been a guy that's like, yeah, I would like to be the GM full time. So to kind of leave him in this role with no deadline in sight is kind of, strange, I guess, to say the least.
Doesn't it seem like a cop-out and a BS answer, a BS explanation as to why you don't have a GM? Like, I compare it to your friend who hasn't had a girlfriend for 10 years, and you ask him why he's been single for so long, and he's always picky. There's always another reason as to why he's single or why he hasn't stayed with a girl. He has a different girl all the time. He can't settle down, and it's because he's so picky and always has a different reason. It's like the Sixers are like that guy right now. It's like, who are the Sixers right now to say that guy isn't, like, that GM isn't out there? There's definitely a GM right now, I'm sure, that if they really wanted him, he has the right price to come in, or there has to be guys out there that they can be sitting down and having conversations with to get a deal done. Like, I just don't understand how this has been going on for so long, and with a team in the position that they're in, that they can just be so casual about saying, yeah, we'll just have Elton Brand and Ned Cohen and Eversley. Oh, and just add Brett Brown, his responsibility to his plate, and they'll just figure it out. We'll be fine. Like, I just don't. How is that okay? How is that satisfactory for them?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think it's strange, and especially like you said, where they're at in terms of a team that's close to contention. You think you would want these issues settled. I think one factor is obviously the previous GM decisions under this ownership group. You look back, obviously Sam Hinkie was a very divisive hire that, spawned a lot of debate still to this day in the city. And then they replaced him with a guy that, basically embarrassed himself and the franchise with, the Twitter scandal with his wife and everything, and Brian Colangelo. So I think they're being very calculated and careful with, who they're going to bring in. This is going to be the third GM in, just a little over 2 years, which obviously isn't a great reflection on the ownership group. Most of the best franchises in this league, the stability starts from the top at the ownership. They get people in place in the GM job that they can trust and kind of let them run things. And that just hasn't been the Sixers' way. They meddled in, they put Sam in and gave him a lot of power, but then they, kind of meddled in his plan and moved him out, and then put Brian in, and he, did himself wrong. So I think they're really trying to be calculated in who they're going to bring in next, and I think that kind of leads to them to be what you said, being a little overly picky or not knowing exactly, do they want to bring in a new guy that's an up-and-comer? They obviously want to get a guy that's established, but they don't want to give an established guy all of the power, kind of like Brian had. So they've kind of backed themselves into a corner in terms of what they're looking for, and I don't know exactly, what direction they're going to go in to get out of it.
Mike, it's Scott Grayson here, and basically along sort of the same lines of what you were just talking about. To me, it just seems like at this point you have a very coveted job here. You have, there's most guys would want to take over this job as a GM with such great talent, young talent on the team right now. Why would they? And if they want that perfect candidate, if there's this guy, and you got to believe they have a list of 2-3 names that they feel if they ever became available, they would go after. Couldn't you at this point just take a flyer on some up-and-coming new young talent that people are, you're hearing about that's like, hey, let's try this young GM for a year or two and see if maybe he develops into the real deal. And if not, maybe one of these two guys will be available that we were looking at 2 years ago.
I think that's an approach that they ultimately might end up taking, Scott. I think that's definitely possible because, they tried to get R.C. Buford in San Antonio. They were interested in Daryl Morey in Houston, some of these bigger name guys that you're kind of alluding to, and they struck out, it was something you would expect. Obviously, those guys don't want to leave, the post that they're in now that they've built up for themselves. And I think, if they're looking for a kind of a collaborative effort, which is kind of the vibe I've gotten from the team and from some of the other reports, that they're not looking for a guy that's really going to be a final decision maker, but more a guy that's going to listen to what Ned Cohen has to say, what Elton has to say, what Mark has to say, what Brett has to say, and kind of factor that all in. And I think a younger up-and-coming guy is a better option for that type of a structure rather than a guy that's kind of already established. So I think ultimately, unless, something happens in the next few months where a coveted GM, like you kind of alluded to, suddenly becomes available, ultimately I think it's going to come down to them having to, I don't know if you could say settling it, but, going with a guy that might not be quite as known or established as they might have hoped initially.
So, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, I just have one more. All this going on, obviously, we're focusing on it. We're talking about it. What's your sense as to how the team, obviously, as they're wrapping up their summer here, I know you haven't been around the players, but is this going to be much of a distraction for them if this continues, into the preseason?
I really don't think so, Scott. I think it's something that, Brett is so hands-on with these guys, and he's kind of the guy that these players look to and interact with on a daily basis. It's not like Brian or Sam was down. They would be around, but it's not like they were interacting directly with these guys. I think Brett has done a really good job of keeping things steady despite what's been, a plethora of, front office and ownership issues over the past few years. I think that'll continue. These guys are really focused. Having some of the veterans around like, JJ, Amir helped last year. And now you have guys like Ben and Joel who are coming into their own as, young stars and leaders. And I think they're kind of, focused to the point that they're not necessarily worried about who the GM is at this point. They're more worried about, who's coaching them and who's on the floor with them. So it's something that obviously will still get talked about in the media. We'll be talking about it until someone's named, basically. But I don't think it's something that, if there's no one in place in training camp, I don't think it's something that'll affect the team, on the court at least.
MKB, since the dismissal of Brian Colangelo in June, Coach Brett Brown has served as the franchise's interim GM, and he's been surrounded by Ned Cohen, Mark Eversley, and Elton Brand. Cohen is the assistant general manager, and Eversley is the senior VP of player personnel. They're going to be the primary day-to-day operators of the front office. Elton Brand is VP of basketball operations, working in now the Sixers front office and running the G League. They're also going to promote Alex Rucker, Senior VP of Analytics and Strategy. They're moving assistant coach Kevin Young onto the front of the bench to replace Jim O'Brien. They're moving Jim O'Brien to serve as a senior advisor to Brett Brown. I mean, I'm out of breath just going through all of those structure, move arounds right there. Like, to me, this seems like a restructuring for somewhat long term, at least like for the next year, at least for the season. They wouldn't be doing this if they're aggressively pursuing a GM. Am I wrong in that? No,
Ryan, you actually took the words out of my mouth. That's what I made. They sound like moves of a team. Up. It's not something that if they were going to, hire someone within the next few weeks, they wouldn't shuffle these cards like this and make all these moves. It definitely seems as though they're setting themselves up so they could be comfortable long term, at least until maybe next offseason with the structure. The GM, I think that's something that not a lot of people would have necessarily thought too much about. You'll be like, all right, they're promoting a guy internally. He knows the franchise. So I thought it was, considering that they promoted these guys but didn't name one of them the GM, I thought that was a little strange, and it definitely comes off as a move of, something that they're not really desperate to make a change to,
Yeah, absolutely. MKB joining us on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. I can talk about this article with you for an hour, man, but unfortunately we got to let you go. I appreciate you jumping on board with us to talk Sixers and the GM search. I appreciate your time, MKB.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Thanks for having me on.